Today we're going to talk about Dagger2. I've already explained Dagger1 in a previous series, and if you're interested in Dagger1, please go back and watch those. Now, let's hop in and talk about Dagger2. There are a couple of things that are different from Dagger1, so we're just going to cover those very briefly. Back in Dagger1, the way that the system was architected had a couple of problems. One was it had this graph composition at runtime, which basically hurt performance, and specifically in a backend scenario, basically meaning that the graph was the object graph that was composed each time a request was made. The second issue is with reflection. Now, there's a little bit of reflection that is inside of Dagger1, and that caused some problems, and it was really hard to make the code easy to follow, and it made ProGuard a nightmare to configure, if almost near impossible. And sometimes you had to resort to commercial tools to get ProGuard to work with Dagger1. And finally, the code that was generated was actually pretty ugly, and it was pretty difficult to read compared to regular instantiation that you would see from different type of factories. So, long story short, the authors of Dagger1, which are the great folks over at Square, said, hey, we're going to have to handle this in Dagger2. Now, thankfully, Google hopped in and decided to help out with migrating to Dagger2. So some of the underlying architecture did have to change to make sure you could fix some of these concepts in Dagger2. Now, some of the things that were addressed as part of these fixes in Dagger2 is that there was going to be no more reflection. So everything was going to be done with concrete calls, and you wouldn't have to worry about any slow reflection happening at all. Now, this made ProGuard super easy to work with because it didn't really require any configuration. Furthermore, there was no more of that runtime graph composition, meaning that every time a request is made, the graph was composed. This increased performance quite a bit. And it's very interesting that Google did a little bit of research on this, and from what I can tell, it's right around 13% faster, according to a gentleman by the name of Gregory Kick. And furthermore, the code is a lot more traceable because the generated code is a lot cleaner and there's no reflection. So it's easier to make the code readable, and it's easier to follow. If you've ever had to follow any code that heavily relied on reflection, it's like black magic, because all of a sudden you'll come to a dead end, but you're not really at a dead end because you have to do some type of reflection to hop over this big castle of a wall to see what's on the other side. Now, that's not the case with Dagger2. So everything is a lot better generated, and you can actually trace these calls all the way down the object graph. So that's great. Let's talk about how we can set up Dagger2 inside of our project. So I'm going to hop back over to our trusty project here. And again, this is the project we've used before. This is called Tasco. And right now, this application, if you haven't seen this application before, it's just a to-do list application that has some features built into it, and we have some tests and so forth. But this time I'm going to add some dependency injection. And so what I've done here is I've added these three lines, line 43 through 46, that's adding Dagger2. And now we're using Dagger.2.0.2, and then we're also having to use this JavaX annotations here for some annotations that are inside of the library and so forth. But these are the three things that are needed inside of our dependency list. Now, we also do need to add, for some code generation, this plugin up top here. So we see how we apply this plugin. But to get that, we actually need to put that inside of our build.gradle that is at the root of our application. So let's go to the root. And we see I have added this here, which is the dependency for the build script itself. And I'm using JCenter, so that's kind of standard. And we add this as a dependency, and this is going to be in the root build Gradle. We go inside the applications build.gradle file. We're going to apply that plugin up here, and this helps with the code generation. That's what we need there. And then, of course, we've added our dependencies, which we already talked about here. So now, the first thing that we need to actually implement inside of Dagger, well, before we get into that, let's talk about a couple of the things that we do have in Dagger that we will need to implement. Now, in Dagger2, we have modules, we have components, we have basically the container where it's going to live, which we'll put inside the application this time for simplicity's sake. And then we have the actual injection that's taking place. And you can use name injectors, all that kind of stuff here. So first thing we're going to do is actually just create a module. And a module is basically very similar to a module in Dagger1, if you're familiar with them. And they provide us with the ability to provide methods for any of the injectable dependencies that we may want inside of our application. Now I'm going to put all of my code just inside of the root package here. So I'm going to just call this one, for simplicity's sake, application module. I'm going to add it to Git because I'm using Git as source control. I'm going to add the module annotation here. Now, notice one thing here in Dagger1, we had a bunch of options that we could put inside of here. Now we only have a list of includes. A whole bunch of other options are kind of gone and moved out to other locations, and new defaults have been applied, which we'll talk about here too. Now, previously, you would provide your injects inside of a particular module. Now that has moved into another location, which we'll talk about next. But let's talk about the module for a second. This is where we're going to provide all of our provider methods for the things that we're going to inject. And one of those things we may need to inject is going to be a context. So let's go ahead and write that now. So what we do is we're going to write, as before, provides annotation singleton. And so this basically tells Dagger that we want to create a method that's going to provide something here. I'm going to say public context, provide context. And what we're going to do here is we need a way to return a context value. Now, I don't have anything to return here because I'm just in a module, so I need a way to get a context. So I'm going to create a constructor here, and you can just use Command N, hit constructor to generate the constructor for you, and then I'm going to put the application inside of here. So it's just an Android application. That's the application object. I'm going to assign it to a local field. And then what I can do inside here is just return that application because, it is a context itself. So now I can return a context. And so this tells Dagger, hey, this is something that's going to be provided. And by the way, I want you to treat it as a singleton. So don't try to recreate it. Don't give new instances or anything like that. Just treat it as a singleton. That wraps it up for this episode. In the next episode, we're going to talk about components and how to tie everything together inside the application object, and then actually perform some injection inside of the main activity to bring it full circle. Until next time.